Hi, Paulo. I'm trying to cover a long sort of time span, so I probably have to go very fast. And you kick me if I spend too much time on a single slide. What I want to, oops, so this is already not going well. Okay. So this is a talk about the history of a package called doc and what is probably about to happen with it. So a bit of introduction. We have a long time span as far as typesetting is concerned. I've put a couple of major points here. There are more. You could argue with them, but never mind. So there was Gutenberg about 500 years ago who came up as one of the inventor of movable type. I mean, there are others, and there are disputes about this. Then it took a long time, and then we came to typewriters. And then about 40 years ago, we had TeX showing up on this scale, and then there were about 4 decades to come to today, and this is the area where I want to focus on. Basically, in those 4 decades, we have seen, what is this? Oh, sorry, this is the morning time, and I'm still asleep. I'm starting to give you the talk about this afternoon. So this is not going to work.
Thank you.
I could. So this is fun. Beg your pardon. You should have said something about the fact that the title is a quarter century of doc, and I'm not actually talking about doc, but the things are actually related to some extent, which is why I completely managed to do this. So, okay, make this a bit bigger. Wonder when I would have noticed what I'm doing. Okay, so let's try again. It's nearly the same time span, really, not quite. But in 1984, Don came up with this kind of idea of literate programming, and I was pretty young at that time, just a year or so in the tech world in some sense, and I learned about this, and I thought this is really a great idea. And I want to do that for myself as well, as far as my tech and LaTeX programming is concerned. So I ended up and produced some poor man's literate programming, and that was doc around 88, the first time. So it's nearly 30 years old. And the machines were very slow at that time, so even just having comments in your files slowed down the processing of the documents considerably. So pretty soon after, there was docstrip, which was then taking out all this wonderful documentation. That was the literate programming idea that I had built into doc. And then a while later, there was a second version of doc with some extensions, and then this second version stayed basically until today. And because there was nothing happening, this is again more than, well, roughly two decades old, because there was no change, we had some offsprings. People were starting to build their own improvements, because I didn't do anything, and it stayed this way. And so you have a bunch of those. A few here, down here, are actually from the LaTeX team itself, where when we were working on the LaTeX programming languages, we wanted to have some more features, so we ended up with a little bit of extra there. But on the whole, there were sort of some extra stuff happening over the last 2 decades. So here, for example, you have hyperref support, then docx, introduced the idea of new document elements, because the original documentation package doc was only supporting macros and nothing else. I mean, I introduced environments a little bit, but it was never really good. Those are having some other extra ideas inside, and as I said, there was some support that we did for LaTeX 3. So, quick evaluation about these 2.5, 3 decades. Was it successful? Was it good? And what's the overall conclusion here? And was it successful? I would claim yes. By now we have, I think, 80% of all LaTeX packages being done using doc. Maybe even more these days on CTONG. Was it good? No. Effectively not. As examples, I had a bunch of questionable interfaces being put into doc.sty. For example, if you can even see it, how many spaces are between the percent? Thank you very much, but you have to know it. And it is kind of a little bit weird, just because I thought indenting by 2 spaces is a good idea, and so you end up with 4 if you outside have your macro environment, and then you have the code environment inside. It's kind of a nuisance and a pain sometimes. Then there are missing interfaces. There was no support for any object other than a simple macro, which was fine in the beginning, but once you start really trying to do documentation in form of kind of literal programming, you want to say this is a variable, this is a user interface variable, this is an internal something, you might want to say this is an environment, you might invent all kind of stuff. And there was no support for that. What does it say here? Yeah, environment was added at some point, but this was never really fully functional. I mean, in the index, for example, it might take away eat the first letter of the environment because it was still expecting a backslash to take away and stuff like that. It never really sort of looked very good. And then there's something that I really like, which is the false friend, which survived the whole time. Because when I started to write this, German English, not very good in English. In German, eventuell means perhaps. And so I thought, stop eventually means stop perhaps. Because you may want to stop here or you may not. But of course, eventually actually means something else. And so this one here is complete rubbish, but everybody is using it, and funnily enough, all the extensions were also using it. Even the extensions that says, oh, some of the definitions or names that I used are not good, here are some better names. This one survived. Okay, here's the kind of Portuguese variation of it. There's a similar kind of sort of false friends here. Yeah, overall conclusion about the whole thing, I think 2 really. On one hand, having that standard was actually good. And having a standard where all people start relying on and are able to easily use it is actually an improvement, and that was a very good thing. Changing a standard is rather difficult once it's there, and this is one of the reasons why all the offsprings didn't really make it. I mean, yes, everybody put a lot of effort in his little idea or her little idea to improve it, but they didn't get much followers. On the other hand, it is not really the best thing. And so at some point, I really thought there has to be a new version. Now, given all that, what I just said, what should be the goals for a new version of that? First of all, we have to obey the fact that, or we have to look after the fact that we have a hugely used standard. So any change, any addition, any improvement should really, really support the existing usage. So that's extremely important. And what I think what is very much missing, and what you can see in the attempts of the people who produce the offsprings, is that there is a need for additional structural markup to be used in your documentation beyond what Doc currently provides. So that is one thing that I thought is important for a new version of Doc. And the other thing is that these days you have a lot of documentation, or in general you have a lot of documentation which is intended for either web display or for PDF documents that you have on your PC and so on and so forth. And there, to have hyperlinks in your documentation is a very important aspect of good documentation, to work with it. So the new version of Doc should actually support that more or less out of the box. So those are the three sort of goals that I set myself when I finally got around looking at this again. And so I did a little bit of, well, basically stealing ideas of the people who felt they were unhappy with the existing Doc. So I looked around, and my basic conclusion was that, first of all, hyperref support was nicely provided by Heiko in form of an add-on package for Doc, if you like. So that was something that should be sort of reused and integrated to become available as a standard, if you like, in the thing. And then there was a package by Didier Vernat. Some of you will know him from previous tech conferences. And he had built a mechanism to introduce new document elements. So you could say there is a, I don't know, this is a tech counter or this is a LaTeX counter, and you then had a concept to describe those and document them properly. I thought the mechanism as such was very good, or conceptual-wise was fine. I didn't like the interface. So what I ended up with is saying, yeah, the ideas are good, but I make my own implementation, basically. So that's this. And then there are a bunch of others that I looked at and had some sort of little bits and pieces that I wanted. So my current idea is something like providing a configurable interface for introducing new document elements. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you see kind of the idea is you have a key value interface that you can use to provide a new element. So for example, the top one here, it says renew doc element because there is already an existing default for environments. And then you can say certain things about how this will behave. So the first one said it is not like a macro, so it doesn't expect to be, it doesn't have a backslash. I mean, this is the basic two things in the tech world. Either it's a command or it's something that is conceptually just a string in some sense. The rest is about indexing and printing in the documentation, so I'm not going to go into this as an example. And then there are two mandatory arguments. The first one is the name or the name part of the command that is used in describing. So if you know doc syntax, you know there is something like backslash describe macro. And so this would be then backslash describe env, and there are some other print macro, and so there will be then automatically a print env. So it builds the same kind of interface, just with a new name, modeled after the one that is already sort of existing in the document. And this is the environment form. So you say begin environment and end environment, and this gives you then, similar to begin macro, end macro, the functionality. The reason why I explicitly require that you say renew command, I mean, some people just say declare something, and if it's already existing, you declare it again, or you override it, basically. I didn't want to do this because chances are very high that some of that is actually overwriting existing functionality, which is for something completely different, and thereby breaking the whole thing. And so it is, I thought it is better to explicitly require that you know you are overwriting something, and you understand that the overriding does the right thing and not sort of do. So if you say new doc element and it finds it is already existing stuff that it tries to define, then it will complain. So this is basically what the sort of basic idea here is as far as the extensible interface. This now gives you the possibility to have big sort of complex indexing and so on, so you can group your environments. I shouldn't talk too long about a single slide, I think. Should turn that off. So okay, yeah. So this is kind of that part. There are, as I said, a couple of others that there are little bits and pieces that some of them I will integrate. Some of them are sort of complementary to what I now introduce as a general thing. So what's the problems? Well, one problem is the question of how to introduce hyperref without sort of making problems with the existing documentation. Initially, I thought, oh yeah, this is so sort of fundamental, I can make it standard out of the box. So by default, doc will now hyperref, and if you don't want it, you have to say whatever, some options to say that it doesn't. Unfortunately, that doesn't work because there are quite a number of people who introduce doc in their class files as a sort of sub-package or whatsoever, and also introduce hyperref in the same thing, and you end with the famous option clash. Because the things then are loaded twice, and one time with some extra support and one sometimes not. So that's an issue. And I think the conclusion, you can't read the red one, can you? I can't read from here, sorry. It says, integrating hyperref has the danger of hyperref option clash, just as I said. I think the conclusion is really that I have to make it available, but you actually explicitly have to ask for it on the use package line. So the old documentation will be as before, and the new one will be. And again, you can't read that. Sorry, quality is not. Yeah, adding additional support commands for the documentation. I mean, something like /meta to have angle brackets to describe sort of what is the abstract data that you put into some argument or stuff like that, or the nice shorthand CS for control sequence or stuff like that. If I would do this, then there's a high chance that old document have done the same and they have said new command or whatever, and those then will clash again as far as the old documentation is concerned. So I guess by the end of the day, again, this will be not there by default, but only by request. So I will probably provide a sort of what I think and what I've seen other people thought nice shorthands for additional documentation features, but you have to say load use package shorthands doc to get it enabled by default. So that's again, it's not perfect, but that is sort of the result of having a huge user base that you don't want to sort of ask them to change their documents. And finally, there is the situation that right now doc has two commands to deal with index, main indexes, and usage indexes, which are handled differently. So if you describe a macro in sort of the introductory documentation, then it is a usage entry, and it is typically typeset in the index as italics. Whereas if you are in the code and you even have selected to have code lines numbered, then you get indexes to the code lines, and to distinguish the two, because both will be numbers, you have a way to sort of mark them up. The typical way of marking them up, as I said, by default is something like italic and non-italic, but you can think of others like underlining the code lines or whatever you want to do. So there is this kind of interface in the current doc to do this. But it is actually not good enough if you introduce new document elements, and those elements may need sort of more sort of structure in the index. So you need something like explicitly saying this is part of the code in the index, which is not necessarily the same as being the main entry or being a usage entry. And so the question is, could I call this code because I called the other as usage? No, you can't really call it code, because that is again a name that is so normal. You're likely to find a lot of documents that actually have defined something like \code. So by the end of the day, I think here I will go the other way around. Those become, if you deprecate it, because they're internal largely anyway, they will be supported. But I will call everything encap for encapsulation on the index, encap code, encap map, stuff like this. Okay. Yeah, way forward on this. There is a test version of this, still sort of, in some sense, in its infancy, basically hooking the new functionality in. Anybody who wants to try, because they are thinking now, oh, I'm scared, I have a lot of documentation in doc, what's going to happen to my documentation if this guy is actually sort of changing it under my feet. There's a way to pick it up. That's where it currently is. My idea is to have that finished throughout this year and show up after a suitable number of tests in the next release of TeX Live, basically. So this is it. Thank you very much. Questions, yeah.
I can always ask questions about documenting code. Would you like to discuss the I guess the architecture of docstrip, of stripping out comments and so on? You could argue that that's not necessary, but the docstrip mechanism is very useful in other ways as well. Would you like to just confirm the fact that you still like the architecture that docstrip uses?
Yeah, I can easily confirm that. I mean, the initial reason, as I kind of hinted in this quick run through the history, is that with doc, I introduced all the documentation in the source file, in the code file, which meant that instead of having 20 lines of code, you suddenly have 200 lines of comments plus 20 lines of code. And initially, that was just really a burden. It took a long time to load those files because file loading was just slow. So that was the initial reason for docstrip. And I agree that reason is no longer really the problem. We still have, in the tech world, a noticeable delay if we are starting to loading files compared to having everything in memory. But it is nowadays just sort of, you don't want to load hundreds of files, but whether you load a file that has 10 lines or whether you load a file that has 1,000 lines, that is not the issue. The issue is loading many files. That still can be a problem if your design is problematic. So in that respect, docstrip wouldn't be necessary any longer. On the other hand, I said poor man's bold or poor man's documentation thing. The doc architecture required that you write your literate programming in the order of your code initially. So if your code goes this way, you actually had to document in this order. Even though logically speaking, it would be much nicer to document the thing in a different order. But because of the code, for some reason, had to be in that order, you basically had the same order in your documentation. With docstrip, that was something we could change. We introduced basically the possibility of marking blocks and reusing those blocks and even rearranging the blocks on the final for the final code production. So all those ideas of doc, including the other sort of little features that got introduced into docstrip over time, that is still a very, very important part of the fact that of the approach of getting to good documentation. So I think that will stay, sure.
Thank you.
And no change in the docstrip interface?
No. I mean, the docstrip interface is in some sense a sort of different beast, and that is suitable. Nobody feels bad about it, I would say. Not much. I mean, we have the extension in LaTeX 3 code that we introduce sort of these private namespace and this stuff so that you can easily write code that is intended just for internal use in a certain package but not exposed to the outside. And this is nicely supported by the extension that we have in form of L3 docstrip. But this is actually a minimal change. And even if we would provide that as a sort of general replacement, I think it wouldn't be noticeable by anybody not using it. So that might happen at some point, but it is not a change in that sense, like the one that I talked about here. Anything else? Done? Fine.